Aloha, I'm Lyla Berg. Mahalo for tuning in to Island Focus. Today's program is the first in a two-part series about the condition of our representative democracy in the United States. A pandemic, civil unrest, and systems and leaders who seem to be failing us are causing many people to lose confidence in our democracy. We're taping the show remotely so you can meet the people who can help us understand how to reestablish belief in our government systems. Thank you for joining us on Island Focus. We really appreciate you spending some time with us, Colin, and helping us understand a little bit more about this thing called democracy and where we are right now. In your role with the UH Public Policy Center, perhaps you can give us a little bit of foundation.
So the Public Policy Center has engaged in a lot of different projects, and one of our more recent projects really is survey research, because we believe that really for democracy to run well, our policymakers have to understand how people are thinking about issues. And in Hawaii, we haven't been all that good about listening to people. We don't have a long-standing poll. In the past, we haven't had a lot of that infrastructure. So some of our work has been trying to build that up, to dig a little deeper, to listen a little more carefully and closely to how people are thinking about the policy issues that affect them today. Relatively recently, we did, I think, one of the largest surveys on attitudes towards tourism that has ever been done by a non-government research entity in the state. So this was independently funded. It wasn't run by HTA or any other state agency. And we asked folks a lot of questions. How do they feel about the tourism industry? What policies might they be willing to explore to reform it? And that, I think, was pretty helpful to policymakers as they began to think about ways to change our approach to, what has been the leading industry in this state since at least the 1960s.
And that's so important, not only listening, but also having the public have a venue to share. That's the basic premise of democracy, right? Is citizen engagement.
Exactly. And, policymakers often hear from people who are very opposed to an issue or very supportive of an issue, but they don't often have access to that big picture. And that, to my mind, is what the survey research provides. It doesn't always get you specific answers. You have to do interviews and other things for that, but it does provide a broad perspective to understand what everybody thinks, not just those who are the most vocal.
So taking that information that's most recent and applying it to where we are right now is really helpful. But perhaps you can take us back a little bit. I'm worried personally.
Sure. I don't think anyone who's been watching what's gone on recently could be anything but worried. Nationally, our democracy, I think, has been under attack, and locally we have our challenges too. And I think for people who've studied the history of Hawaii and especially its post-statehood history, there was a moment in time, particularly in the late 60s, I would say, through the 70s, the period of the 1978 Constitutional Convention, where Hawaii was, I think, one of the leading democracies of the United States, where we had some of the highest rates of voter turnout, where the legislature would regularly be at the leading edge of policy issues, from environmentalism to land use regulations to social issues. And at some point along the way, maybe in the mid-90s, a lot of that began to collapse, and we ended up in a situation where we had one of the lowest voter turnout rates in the nation, where our legislature seemed to consistently be behind the ball, kind of playing catch-up to states on the U.S. continent. That's something we want to get back that pride. The sense that this is a small place that can still do big things.
Do you think that transition happened because people got too comfortable or too complacent or taking for granted the fact that we have this system?
Lyla, I think there's an element of truth to that. If you look at the people who were part of the legislature back in that earlier period, these were people who really understood struggle. And they really felt passionately about making life better for everybody. But they came from a background of true deprivation. And I think, that really led, I think, to their commitment to making things better through honest government and public policy. And I think we have lost a little bit of that. Perhaps people are a little too comfortable. They don't really see it as a necessity. A lot of people in the legislature now come from relatively comfortable backgrounds. I mean, that's true throughout the nation, but here in Hawaii too, who don't always, I think, experience the urgency of poverty or houselessness in a way that an earlier generation really knew more what that was like.
Well, without revealing too much, I am of that generation that grew up in the 60s and 70s when we were comfortable here, but the world was in a mess. Maybe not dissimilar from now, but something in society was compelling us to be involved and to speak up. And if we look at democracy's foundation of citizen engagement, that's what worries me right now.
And you were part of a special generation, and I think it was because of a lot of those international events. The Vietnam War, for example. I mean, if you look at who is still active in politics, it really, in some ways, is still dominated by people of that generation, people who were politicized at a relatively early age. You think of some of our leaders, like, for example, Governor Abercrombie, who got his start really as an anti-war protester. You can see examples of that where people were so frustrated that it forced them into politics, and they gained those skills that have stayed with them for the rest of their lives. I think there's a little bit less of that, and it may have something to do with our retreat into more virtual spaces. That might contribute to part of it. I think that a sense of cynicism contributes to part of it too. When I speak to my students, I often find that they are sometimes the most cynical people I've ever met. I mean, they don't have a lot of faith in our public institutions. And, interestingly, when they spend more time at the legislature or working with people in the public sector, that usually improves their opinion. I mean, they usually end up thinking, actually, there's a lot of people here who care deeply and are working really hard.
So as we move toward the end of our conversation today, and your point well made that this generation maybe needs something. What might that be?
I mean, one thing we can start with, I think, is improving civic education in our schools. That's something that used to be at the core of a lot of the curriculum that was offered. And I think it has been, as the emphasis has grown on math and English skills in particular, we've kind of left that out. And I think we need to reintegrate that. I think as much as possible, we need to provide opportunities for young people to be involved in politics from a relatively early age. One way where we've done that is allowing 16-year-olds to register to vote. But unfortunately, our public schools haven't quite embraced that as much as they might. So I hope to see more progress there. Really thinking of our public education system as a way to help people become more comfortable participating, to help them be comfortable with voting, to be comfortable with testifying. And those are skills that they'll keep with them forever.
And perhaps urging our incumbent elected people, as well as nonprofit organizations and businesses, to speak about these things, not only voting, but being engaged more than service projects, but really being engaged in some of the solutions.
I hope they are. I mean, and I hope that our legislators see these opportunities to connect with the public as something beyond just an obligation that they have to fulfill for legal reasons, but really an opportunity, especially with young people, to encourage them to become involved in the process.
Well, parting words for our audience.
Don't end up just being cynical. That won't solve the problem for anyone. If you're angry, that's good. Anger is an important emotion, but channel that anger to get involved, to start working on an issue that you know a little bit about and care about, and take the risk to get involved. It'll be a little scary at first, but once you've done it, I think most people feel really empowered from that experience.
Well, thank you again for your time. Your energy is inspiring, and I know our viewing audience appreciates you as well. Thank you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
We've just spoken with Colin Moore, Executive Director of the UH Public Policy Center. Aloha, Jennifer. Mahalo for being with us today and helping us understand how important media is in not only our democracy, but also in our understanding of our role in society. Can you share a little bit, what are you doing at the University of Hawaii School of Communications?
Mahalo for having me on your show, and I'm very happy to speak with your audience. I'd love to talk about information and communication technology and democracy, because that's really the area of work that I do. So there's a lot to discuss here. I'm only going to distill a few kind of key things that are of concern, and towards the end, I can also give a few rays of hope. And so really, I'd like to focus mainly on online surveillance and personal data collection, and the role that that has in how that's being weaponized against our democracy. And so just over a decade ago, we were all very excited about the Arab Spring, what seemed to be the endless democratic potential of social media. And now just a few years later, we're sitting here saying, are we governed actually by these algorithms, or are we the ones that are essentially governing our nation? And so when it comes to personal data profiles, we've all heard about them. We've all heard of personal privacy. But a key thing that we don't really understand typically is that throughout your day, when you're going about your business, using your phone, using apps, browsing the web, even walking around town, there may be things like facial recognition systems, all sorts of automated things that are collecting data about you. And this data is very important because it's being aggregated, collected, and then mined for insights. And this becomes really important because what happens to the data once it leaves our person really is not transparent. We really can't know. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of data use and reuse that's happening down the pipe. So on one hand, as a scholar, I and many others are very worried about the potential for discrimination caused by these types of algorithmic sorting. On the other hand, something that I think I want to focus a little more on today is the idea of the targeted advertising and the erosive effect of that on our democracy. So targeted advertising, of course, is being able to send an ad via the internet or your mobile phone to a particular person based on their data profile. Frankly, these profiles enable advertisers and others to understand a little bit more about how we think, what motivates us, what little nudge might push us in a certain direction to either have a belief, take an action, and so forth. And so this means that really anyone who wants to send a particular group of people messages can buy these profiles and the access information. So a great example of this happened in 2017 when ProPublica discovered that Facebook was enabling potential advertisers to target what seemed to be sort of hate groups. And so this is obviously a huge problem. You can only imagine that people who would want to target these groups would have some type of hateful rhetoric. And so even in the less extreme cases that we're dealing with now, we're getting nudged in all sorts of direction by these advertisements and also by the so-called recommender algorithms. That is, when you watch something on YouTube or you go on TikTok, you're being recommended the next thing based on what it thinks you'll like. The problem is, of course, that all of this is really based on generating more money for the platforms, for the content creators, and so forth. And it's not really looking at our democracy. It's not looking at our community and the well-being of our community. So there's a ton of research, of course, about this. I won't go into a lot of detail because I know that your audience in particular, and me as well, really want to talk more about the solutions. So the hard news here is that there's not an easy solution, but there's a three-pronged approach we can use, I believe, to minimize this damage. The first thing, of course, is it's already being employed by a number of the tech firms themselves, the tech companies, the Facebooks, Metas, and so forth, is using algorithms or other technologies to do more filtering that is sort of policing these harmful or deleterious messages. That has been criticized as really not going far enough, though. And certainly it's only a very small part of the solution. A second one is, of course, our educational and social things, understanding better how to protect our data, understanding more about misinformation, disinformation, and so forth. So we know that there's bots, for example, social bots that are spreading vast amounts of information that is not only incorrect, but purposely incorrect in order to, again, nudge us in these certain directions. And then the third one, and I think a big one right now that's probably a giant piece of the puzzle, is really the policy and legal solutions. So we know, for example, that right now these platforms really aren't accountable. They may get a lot of public scrutiny. Congress may call them in to testify with threats, but essentially, they're really not liable for anything that you or I post on the platform. On the other hand, we don't want to get into a situation where we make them fully liable and therefore end up limiting freedom of expression and so forth. So it's a really difficult balancing act. Right now, a lot of folks are looking at something like the revision of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, making it so that there is more responsibility, although this is still unclear that exactly what this balance will be for the platforms themselves, reclassifying them not as neutral tech companies, but really as media companies that are responsible in some way for the content that they share.
What advice could you give? What counsel could you give the average person like myself to become more discerning and be more, maybe not even more critical about what I'm hearing?
The most basic thing, of course, is to just assess the messages that you're seeing, particularly because we know that we're being targeted with messages that are going to be like what others in our social networks like and things like that. Because we know that, we can look more critically. We can look at external news sources. We can look for validation. There's a lot of wonderful efforts underway to do fact checking and things like that to halt the spread of misinformation. Another thing that we can do, again, is be a little more careful about our personal data. Doesn't mean we shouldn't use the platforms. I certainly use them myself, but limiting the types of things that we would put on there. And certainly when it comes to things like political advertisements or other messaging that leads one towards political action or things like that, just being very critical of each message. It's not as easy to do as that, but that's really where we have to start. Certainly, we've got a lot of great educational programs in the K-12, all the way up through college, but it really takes a personal responsibility, I think, of each of us to think before we click to forward or share, and to realize that there are these systems working behind the scenes that really aren't to our collective advantage. So,
parting words, if you could.
I would say be hopeful, but it is a responsibility, right? It is a responsibility for each of us. If we want our communities to thrive, if we want our democracy to live, none of us can just sit back. We all have to take action in whatever way we can. And it really can start with something as simple as thinking before you share.
Thank you so much for your time. You know, you've helped us understand probably more than we might want to know, but thank you very much. Thank you for listening to my conversation with Jennifer Winter, who is the professor at the University of Hawaii School of Communications. Thank you so much for joining us today, Gavin. You know, it means a lot that you can help us understand more about democracy and also what your organization does. Can you give us a little background on Hawaii Appleseed and how that supports our democracy?
Hawaii Appleseed Center for Law and Economic Justice is a research and advocacy organization that works to identify and uplift policies and systems change that helps create a Hawaii where everybody can thrive. So that means that we focus on affordable housing issues, on tax and wage issues, and anti-hunger work as well, food security. And in terms of democracy, all of our work hinges on our democracy here in Hawaii. So working a lot at the legislature, sometimes working in the courts to rectify injustices, like one example, ensuring the preservation of affordable housing projects where there's been a promise made to maintain the affordability of a housing development that was built with government funds. And then that promise has been broken, trying to get out from under those affordability restrictions early. Typically, our work impacts hundreds or thousands of people on the issues that we take up.
It's kind of exciting, though, isn't it? In a way. I mean, it's heartbreaking. And at the same time, you know you're making an impact.
There are so many wonderful social service provider organizations out there that are helping people with their day-to-day, like individual needs. That is so critical. But if we don't address the broader systemic issues, then we have real problems. The real problems that we're actually facing in terms of housing affordability, in terms of really close to half our population not being able to afford to meet their basic needs. That's the kind of stuff that we're trying to address. Ideally, we'd be putting those social service providers out of a job because we'd create an economy and government where everybody can thrive.
Well, looking at the news and everything that's happening internationally, nationally, locally, some of us, our hearts are breaking because the confidence that we had in people and in systems seems to be shaky right now. How can you help us bring back, this sense that we are safe in a representative democracy?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really getting back to the basics, the ideals of our country's constitution, a government by the people and for the people. Those are ideals that we've never really met. And in some ways, it makes sense. The ideals come, like the concepts come, the language comes before the action evolves. So we've had over 200 years since the United States adopted the Constitution, and we've gotten better. So we no longer have those categorical exclusions on voting, though we still have problems there, obviously. We no longer have chattel slavery, but we still have people working 40 hours a week and unable to afford food and shelter. We need to do better. And we can. We absolutely can.
Okay, so help us with the can. What can we do?
Well, I think it's really to the extent that you're able to get involved in government and influence policy, like do it. But I think really our government systems and structure needs to change to allow people to engage. So all the decisions that we're making now are not made by the people who are suffering the adverse consequences of those decisions. One example is, there's a governor's housing stakeholders work group. We're fortunate to be a part of that work group. And there are a bunch of developers and like heads of government agencies that are part of that work group. There's not a single person on that work group that's struggled with housing insecurity, that's struggled with houselessness. It's called a housing stakeholder work group, but it is missing so many important stakeholders. I'm really inspired by the example of someone named James Koshiba, a good friend. He was tapped to lead the housing subcommittee of the House Select Committee on COVID that was created in response to the pandemic. He brought together this wonderful, diverse group of perspectives that included nonprofit and business CEOs. It included the government agency folks, like the usual suspects there, but it also included people who had experienced housing insecurity and houselessness. And by bringing those people together and creating an environment where everybody's voices were heard, they were able to craft this really great and effective rental assistance, like pandemic rental assistance program that worked way better than if you hadn't had those voices at the table that were saying, oh, I've experienced trying to get those that assistance before, and this was my experience, and we need to avoid that. That's what we need to do, and that is so rare in our government today.
It's so rare in our government. However, it is Hawaii. We come together.
It is Hawaii. It is aloha. It is like caring about everybody and ensuring, there's no way that Hawaii would have treated people the way we're treating them now. And we just need to get back to those roots and instill that ethic into how we operate our government and how we structure our policies.
Well, and as we wrap up our conversation for today, what you're saying is not only instill it in the government system, but in our families, in our communities, and remind ourselves about who we are.
Exactly. Exactly. Gandhi's quote, "Be the change that you want to see," is not just about getting out there and advocating. It's about, like, if you're a business owner, like, pay people a living wage, treat people well, and get out there and speak up for people when you see that needs to happen.
That's a wonderful message as we leave our conversation today. And I want to thank you so much for the work you're doing and for bringing people together and for holding the bigger vision of what's possible.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate the conversation.
You've just had the opportunity to meet Gavin Thornton, Executive Director of the Hawaii Appleseed Center for Law and Economic Justice. Thank you for being with us today on Island Focus. I'm Lyla Berg. On behalf of the Island Focus crew and the entire team at Ōlelo Community Media, aloha and malama pono. Let's do our best to do things right, to take care of each other in our island home. See you soon.